Well, good morning, everyone. Carla had a question for me when she came in this morning, and it comes from the First Chronicles. And so everybody put your thinking caps on, because I don't have my notes for that, and I may have to wait to help her answer that. But it was concerning David taking the census, right, Carla? Okay. And your question, Carla, was?
It obviously was wrong for God to punish him.
Sorry, what?
When he took the census, he was not supposed to take the census in chapter 21.
Yeah.
Right? And he was punished for that.
Yeah.
I want to know where they have mentioned about taking the census, where it was wrong.
Oh, okay. I thought you said it was wrong for God.
Right.
God
No,
to,
that's not right.
well,
I can't remember where my passages were. I think I went to Exodus, didn't I? Jeremy, when God asked Moses,
it's probably
or was
Exodus
it Numbers?
Probably Exodus or Numbers.
Exodus or Numbers, yeah. And the reason I went back there to that passage was to show that God had asked Moses to do that at that time. He asked Moses, you take account of the people. And then there was another passage, I believe that I had also, where God asked, hi Robert, where God asked Moses, I think it was, to do that again. And I can't remember those passages where they were now, and I have them on my stick, but time I go back and find. But if no one can think of them, then I'll have that ready for next week. But remember, I said with David, there was nowhere in our passages in that story where it says God asked him to take it, to take that the census. And all we could presume from that story was, it seems that David's pride caused him to do that. They were guessing. But, Jeremy, did you?
Well, I don't have the exact verse. In Numbers 1, God told them to number the people. And
right.
It was the point always was, the Israelites were not to trust in their numbers. They were to trust in God. If you remember the story of Gideon.
Right.
How many times was he told, all right, cut the people like as far as you're trusting too much in numbers. It was God. I can't find the verse, and so maybe I'll look too. But they weren't. If God didn't command them to do something, they weren't to do it. And God punished David for breaking his command, and so that's why he was punished. The Kings and Chronicles, I think Kings adds, or is it Chronicles that adds that Satan tempted him or something.
Yes.
And there is, David was the one though who in the end did it, and he was punished for it.
Yeah. The reason I had come to my opinion that it was David's pride was, when David decided to do that, he was getting ready for battle. But we saw in 1 Chronicles 21 that Joab told him, you shouldn't do this. So Joab was warning him, don't do it. Joab wasn't the most faithful. It always seemed he did things that would better him. But he knew that David wasn't to do that. So he warned David, but then David doesn't take any heed to his word. David just, it says in verse 4, nevertheless the king's word prevailed against Joab, and therefore Joab left. But also in Moses' time, Moses had to take the census quickly, but we see Joab took 10 months to get the numbers. It looked like he wasn't in any big hurry. He didn't want to do this anyway. Joab knew that that was wrong. And so for that reason, taking it from that story, then that's why I said it. I think it was David's pride that made him take the census, and God punished him for it. But I think safely we can say God punished him because God didn't ask him to do it. Jeff?
In 2 Samuel 24, later in the chapter, verse 10 on, David obviously knew what he done.
I remember that point.
Yeah, because David did say in verse 10, he said, David's heart condemned him after he had numbered the people. So David said to the Lord, I have sinned greatly in what I have done. Now I pray, O Lord, take away the iniquity of your servant, for I have done very foolishly. So David clearly knew what he had done was incorrect, wrong. And he must have known that by faith, because you don't know if something is sin unless God has told us.
Right.
So,
Right. I remember us, we used that verse, made the point, David made the confession, didn't he? He said, I've sinned. Because he said, I've acted very foolishly. That's what the American Standard, how it words it. So then we can presume if David said he sinned, he knew he sinned. Why he did it is the only reason we don't really know. But I had thought maybe pride, and it seems everyone kind of thinks that. But obviously, the only thing we know for sure is God didn't tell him to do that. But he told Moses to do that, to number them. And that's a good thought and a good question, because I wondered about that myself. That's why I dug up all them verses at that time. Was why God he asked Moses to do it one time? Why is he getting after David?
And I said sometimes when we read, we got to be careful that we understand why God did something, and that sometimes context is very important. When we read context, when we read for examples and commands that God gave, is it a command that God gave everybody, or is it a command that God gave a specific person, specific situation? Like, as far as we have to be careful that we understand what the scripture is saying. Just because Moses numbered the people didn't mean that was God. That's what God wanted.
Right.
But obviously, it's just the same. David knew that something was wrong. And he was punished, yes, but he knew he had done wrong. And if we didn't know we'd done wrong, we might think we were treated unfairly. Well, you never said don't do this. Or it happened in the past, or you said it was okay, or whatever it was. When David never complained he was being treated unfairly.
No.
Or unjustly by God.
Right.
He knew he had done wrong, and he accepted God's punishment for it.
Right.
And so, why God didn't want him to number the people? That's up for speculation and not for.
Right.
But the fact of the matter is he didn't.
Right.
And so David should have obeyed, and he didn't.
Exactly. You're right. And truthfully, we shouldn't speculate. But we do know for a fact David knew he did. David knew why he did it. Even knowing God had not asked him.
This if we knew that certain people had to carry the Ark of the Covenant, this is why Uzzah died. This is why, and we went back to see who was allowed to. So, from my question was that was there rule stating that it should not be numbered, like to refer back to that where this was wrong that David did. Not I'm questioning God to say why. It's not that I'm questioning him. It's just as how we could refer back to say certain people were allowed to take the Ark of the Covenant, and in the manner how by walking on the poles. And I know Satan stood up against David at that time. I thought that maybe where can I find it for myself that it is wrong to number other than only if you allowed.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'll have to find that verse. I know it's there, but David knew that he had done wrong once he had done it. So it's someplace. I just can't find it off the top of my head.
Yeah.
And I don't have the internet. We've discombobulated it for me to do.
Well, I'll look at my notes, and when we start Ezra next week, I'll give you all the verses I had. But I did have the one Jeff had, and I remember us all talking about that. David knew it was wrong. He didn't say God punished me unfairly. He said, no, I sinned. So he knew. And that's about all we can go on.
And Joab knew.
And Joab knew,
If Joab, knowing the character of Joab, if Joab puts up a problem, then there really must be a problem.
Right, yeah, because Joab was not a real faithful man, but he knew Jehovah, knew his laws. And by him warning David, that's kind of outstanding, actually. But David should have listened. But yeah, well, and then your second question, while we touch on that at the end of this Second Chronicles. But where we left off last week then was speaking about the contents of Second Chronicles. We left off that the northern kingdom is ignored in Second Chronicles. We don't hear anything about Israel. If you recall in our study of 1st and 2nd Kings, Israel split in two around 731 BC. Remember Solomon's son Rehoboam, he reigned over Judah, which was the southern kingdom that we know of, and Jeroboam, he reigned over Israel, which we've come to know as the northern kingdom. And in her infancy, though, in the time of Moses, God said something to his chosen people back in Deuteronomy 28. In Deuteronomy 28, I'll just read a couple of these now so we can get through our lesson this morning. But in 58, we read, God said to Israel, if you are not careful to observe all the words of this law, which are written in this book, to fear this honored and awesome name, the Lord your God, we go down to 62, then you shall be left few in number, whereas you were as numerous as the stars of heaven. It's interesting here, speaking of the numbering of Israel, the stars of heaven, because you did not obey the Lord your God. It shall come about that as the Lord delighted over you to prosper you and multiply you, so the Lord will delight over you to make you perish and destroy you. And you will be torn from the land where you are entering to possess it. Moreover, the Lord will scatter you among all people from one end of the earth to the other end of the earth, and there you shall serve other gods, wood and stone, which you or your fathers have not known. Among those nations you will find no rest, and there will be no resting place for the sole of your foot. But there the Lord will give you a trembling heart, failing of eyes, and despair of soul. Israel in the beginning was one, and there's what God warned her of. Observe my laws, or else I will delight in watching you fall apart. And we see then, years later, after that saying, here's where we saw Israel split. Rehoboam taking over the south, and Jeroboam reigning on the northern kingdom. Now it's interesting, the northern kingdom, 18 kings reigned over northern Israel, and all were wicked in Israel. And finally in 722 BC is roughly, we see the Assyrians overtake Samaria, that was the capital of Israel, and we hear little of Israel again after that. And so we're asked the question, what explanation may be given for the lack of information concerning the history of the northern kingdom provided in 2 Chronicles. Anybody got a thought on that?
Well, there's a couple things I might think of. The example, there wasn't much an example
Right.
of the king that you could take from the kings of Israel. Like as far as you could, Chronicles wasn't really harping on bad things
Right.
that were done. It did point out obedience and like as far as and some of the bad things, but there wasn't an example for them to follow. There was nothing that they did that would say, well, you go ahead and do that. You go ahead and do that. There were examples that Ezra used, if Ezra's the chronicler, to show the children that came back, this is what God wants you to do. But also, I will say, they weren't the ones coming back. The children of Judah, for the most part, were the remnant that came back. I'm not saying that there were none from Israel, but on the whole, it was the children of Judah that came back. This was their history.
Right.
So there's two possibilities.
Right. No, those are good points. It's Jeff?
I just glanced through the book and noticed a lot of focus on the temple and worship. Things were happening in relation to that. Of course, the northern kingdom wouldn't have much to do with that because that would be encouraging people to temple worship in Jerusalem. I don't know if that's partly true.
That's part of it too. I believe that. I got Jeremy's thought in here and yours. If you remember, then Jeremy spoke of the kings. Remember last week, kind of bored you with all the kings of Judah. We looked at their spiritual and their religious actions, and yet we noticed that there's little mention of Israel's kings here in all that. And only, it seems, the kings that we have here to look at, the only reason they were mentioned was there was a connection between them and Judah's king at the time. Those are the only ones that are mentioned. The rest of them are not mentioned. And like Jeremy said, one reason is they were all wicked, every one of them. And Jeff's thought was that, yes, Judah had her share of bad kings. We saw that. But generally, the nation didn't forsake the duties of the Levitical priesthood and the temple worship. They didn't totally forsake that. They had their ups and downs, we know. But with Israel done away with it right in the very beginning with Jeroboam. They abandoned it. And idolatry reigned in Israel. And as Jeremy made the point, and we talked about that earlier, a lot of the bad things, that King David had done were mentioned in Chronicles. It seemed that the writer here is trying to encourage the remnant now. You're going back to your homeland. So he's trying to strengthen them and reestablish God's word with them. So in a sense, and we see the point, there's no point in reminding them of all the bad things. Remind them of the good things. And let's, build ourselves up. But we see Jeroboam was mentioned in the beginning in chapter 10 in verse 12 and chapter 11 in verse 4. He's mentioned when he took control of the northern nations. Remember in that story, Jeroboam comes to see Rehoboam. Rehoboam decided at that time to go to Shechem for his inauguration. And the people there promised to serve him if he would lighten the heavy yoke that his father had put on him. But we know the story. He checked with the elders who served his father, but then he listened to the young men. And so in outrage, we see Jeroboam, they rebel. The leaders of Israel At that time, the leadership of Jeroboam, they rebelled, the kingdom was divided. But that also fulfilled the word, didn't it, of the Lord through Ahijah, in 1 Kings 11 and 29. So Jeroboam's mentioned there. He's mentioned again with Abijah. Abijah, when he was king, there was a war. There was a war to occur between him and Jeroboam. But in his speech before the battle, Abijah reminds Jeroboam that God had given the kingdom to David and to his posterity. Okay? But Jeroboam, he rebelled against the house of David, didn't he? Wanted nothing to do with it. And he gets together a band of ruthless men to go up against Rehoboam when Rehoboam at the time was defenseless. And that story, if you remember, Israel hoped to win the victory because of its superior numbers. Jeroboam, I can't remember the numbers, thousands more than what man. Israel, remember, they'd set up Judah by contrast, as we said a minute ago, right manner. They had their ups and downs, as we said. But God at that time was captain of Judah's army, and they acknowledged that. And so we see for his prophets. And his prophets say, yes, let's attack them. We'll win. But we see in that story, though, that Jehoshaphat must have possessed a measure of spiritual discernment, because he just wasn't sure. And he said, no, let's check with the prophet of the Lord then and see what he has to say. And so they seek out the advice. At that time, there was only one prophet, Micaiah, I think is his name. They check with him. Well, Ahab hates him, because every time he prophesied against. We see there that Ahab is mentioned only because of his inquiry and the ties with Jehoshaphat. And then we see Ahaziah's fatal alliance with Joram of Israel. Joram is mentioned. And here again, the problem is caused because of the association with the house of Ahab. And in some studying, this is now the third generation that there's been problems with the kings because of their ties with Ahab. 3 generations have suffered because of him. And in that story, we remember Athaliah, the granddaughter of Omri. Remember her joins Joram to war against Syria again. And Jehu and his men in that scene, in that war, found Ahaziah hiding in Samaria, and they killed him. Because if you remember, Jehu had a responsibility. What did God say that would happen to all Ahab's house? Anybody remember? Yeah, and Jehu was the one that was doing that, and because of Ahaziah's ties with Ahab's house, Jehu kills him. We see there, it was interesting, the story of Ahaziah. We remember Moses. He was hidden. He was hidden in the house of Pharaoh. And Joash was also hidden in that story. Remember, because Athaliah would have killed him. But her sister, I think it was, took him and hid him. I think it was. Can you remember?
Sorry, what was that again?
With Athaliah, that was the queen. Remember, she killed everyone. And Joash, was it Joash the one? There's 3 different names.
Yeah, one of them was hidden.
Yeah.
I do remember that story.
Yeah, he was hidden, and then.
We get papers on the mic, which is why it's hidden.
It's tough.
The whole purpose of that was
Exactly. Exactly. And then I thought of Jesus. Where did they go when Herod was killing all the firstborn? Yeah. God uses what he can, doesn't he, to continue to fulfill his promises. And then Ahaz's defeat at the hands of Pekah. Pekah is the last king of Israel that's mentioned. And the reign of Ahaz is marked by the terrible and rapid now degeneration of Israel. He not only restored idolatry, but he was the one that was offering his children to the idol Moloch. Remember in the fires, he was sacrificing his kids. But as the difficulties of his reign increased, he made an alliance with the king of Assyria. And even though Isaiah vehemently told him no, his extreme wickedness made Isaiah nauseous, it said. And we read that this is that King Ahaz in 2 Chronicles 28 and 22. But the instrument used for his punishment were the kings of Syria, who carried off a huge number of Israel from their homes to Samaria. And Pekah not only removed a ton of them, but he killed 120,000, it said, valiant men in that battle. And so we see, these kings from Israel, the only reason they're mentioned was they kind of dragged in Judah's kings into their evil, didn't they? But as we had said earlier, they were all wicked, and so we really don't have much recollection of them at all. And that is probably why they were ignored. As Jeremy said in the beginning, wasn't much of an example there, and especially to a remnant that's going back home now. And also, then in our content, we see that there's numerous prophets, and we're asked the question, which prominent Old Testament prophets are mentioned in 2 Chronicles? We read of one in 2 Chronicles 21, 12 to 15. Who do we read up there? We'll skip over a lot of these passages. Elijah, right. Elijah, his name meant my God is Jehovah. Elijah, we all know, it's been entitled that he was the grandest and the most romantic character that Israel ever produced. Israel known. The only thing we know about him is that he was the Tishbite, we're told, of the inhabitants of Gilead. And that's literally about all we know of him, parentage and his locality. And this may be just because so that we can focus all our attention on his heavenly errand, what God asked of him, and that was to overthrow
that much in 2 Chronicles. A lot of the stories of Elijah aren't there either.
Right.
Because he was the prophet to Israel, not to Judah primarily.
Right.
And so it's one of those byproducts. You don't mention something, and you're going to miss the majority of the character of Elijah. And Elijah was going to be a very important character. It's not saying that they wouldn't have known of him.
No.
They did. But when it comes to John the Baptist, it's the spirit of Elijah. And so they would have had to know who Elijah was. They wouldn't get it maybe from 2 Chronicles, but they would have had
right.
1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. It's just not mentioned in Chronicles.
Right. It says of him in 1 Kings 19 and 10, Elijah was jealous for God, we could say. It says in verse 10 of chapter 19, I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the sons of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I alone am left, and they seek my life to take it away. And then in verse 14, we read something of Elijah there. Well, again, it's the same, sorry, those two verses. But we see Elijah's attitude for God and for his duty to Israel. And then in 2 Chronicles 32 and verse 20, there's another prophet mentioned there. Who is that? Isaiah. Yeah, Isaiah, the son of Amoz. He prophesied concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. Isaiah, we know, had a spirit of uncompromising firmness and boldness, didn't he? He concealed nothing and kept back nothing for the fear of man. And in this passage, we see here that Hezekiah has paid tribute money to Sennacherib, the king of Assyria. He's already paid him tribute money for, I think, twice. And now that king's coming for money again, and Hezekiah refuses to pay him. And Sennacherib, he's outraged, and he demands full surrender. But in this moment of distress, we see that Hezekiah's faith is renewed in Jehovah, and he strengthens his people. He goes to Isaiah and make the statement, there is a greater with us than with him. And Isaiah and Hezekiah devote themselves to prayer to God. And we see that the angel strikes down the Syrian army, and Sennacherib returns home in humiliation. God wiped them out. And Isaiah's life is one that we see is filled with devotion to God. And then in 2 Chronicles 35 and 25, and also in 36, 20 to 23, there's another prophet mentioned there. Who's that prophet? Jeremiah, yeah. Malachi. We sometimes have labeled Jeremiah as a lamenting prophet, and maybe for a good reason time now, he sees the nation moving straight to unrepairable ruin. There's no hope for Israel, and they turn a deaf ear to all the warnings that are given to them. A nation wanted religion of Jehovah. Idolatry was openly established. I was thinking as I was doing this bit on Jeremiah, our world at this time, wow, it's the same. It's the same thing. And they're about to reap the harvest of their sowing. And also then we see there's a lot of lesser known prophets mentioned in 2 Chronicles. We see Ahijah, Iddu, Shemaiah, Azariah, Hanani, Micaiah, Jehu, Jehazel, Zechariah, and Obed, and also Huldah, the prophetess. She's mentioned in that book. And so our last thought, and this is what Kala had spoke about, how could the accuracy of 2 Chronicles be verified during the time period in which it was written? We're probably not going to be able to, because there is some good thought here. It is our last question in 2 Chronicles. I wonder if we should just leave that, and next week we'll start with this and move right into Ezra.